The desert wind carried nothing but dust and regret across the barren landscape as Elijah Morgan rode his weathered mare through the scorching afternoon. His empty whiskey bottle clinked against the worn leather Bible in his saddlebag, neither offering comfort anymore. The sun bore down mercilessly on his broad shoulders, covered by a black coat that had seen better days, much like the man wearing it. 3 days of riding had brought him to the edge of nowhere, where Colorado bled into New Mexico territory. His throat was parched, his soul more so. The last town had run him off when they discovered what he used to be, what he no longer could be. A preacher without faith was like a gun without bullets, useless and potentially dangerous. Dustwood appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its ramshackle buildings leaning against each other for support. As Elijah drew closer, he could make out the weathered sign at the town's entrance, hanging by a single chain and creaking in the wind. Population 189, it claimed, though Elijah doubted half that number still drew breath in this forgotten corner of creation. He guided his horse down the main street, noting the suspicious glances from townsfolk who peered through dirty windows and from shadowed doorways. Dustwood was the kind of place where the law had given up trying, where men came to disappear or die. Sometimes both, perfect for a fallen preacher seeking neither redemption nor recognition. The Queen's Deal Saloon stood at the street's end, its painted sign featuring a queen of hearts with eyes that seemed to follow passers-by. Unlike the other establishments, this one showed signs of care. The porch was swept, the windows clean enough to reflect the dying light. Music and laughter spilled from within, along with the acrid smell of tobacco and cheap whiskey. Elijah tied his mare to the hitching post and pushed through the swinging doors. The noise hit him like a physical force, men shouting over cards, glasses clinking, a piano playing a tune that might have been recognizable if the player had been sober. He made his way to the bar, keeping his head low, just another drifter seeking liquid amnesty. That's when he saw her. Ruby Sinclair stood behind the bar like a crimson flame against the dingy backdrop. Her dress was the color of fresh blood, cinched at the waist and cut just low enough to be interesting without being vulgar. Auburn hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that belonged in a San Francisco parlor. Not a Dust Bowl saloon, but it was her eyes that caught Elijah, green as bottle glass and twice as sharp, taking in everything while revealing nothing. She moved with practiced grace, pouring drinks and collecting coins while maintaining a smile that never quite reached those calculating eyes. When she laughed at something a patron said, it was musical but measured, like a performance she'd given 1,000 times before. What'll it be, stranger? Her voice cut through his observations as she appeared before him, wiping down the bar with a cloth that had seen better days. Whiskey, Elijah replied, his voice rough from the trail. Whatever's cheapest. Ruby's eyes flicked over him, taking in the dusty black coat, the week's worth of beard, the calloused hands that had once held congregations in thrall. Something in her expression shifted. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit in hiding. First one's on the house, she said, pouring amber liquid into a glass that was cleaner than most. You look like you've come a long way to get nowhere special. Before Elijah could respond, a commotion erupted near the poker tables. 2 minors, faces flushed with drink and greed, had risen from their seats. Cards scattered across the floor as one accused the other of cheating. The larger man, built like a mountain with fists to match, grabbed his opponent by the shirt. "You've been dealing from the bottom. Hutchins!" he roared. "I seen it." Hutchins, smaller but meaner looking, pulled a knife from his boot. "Call me a cheater again. Morrison. See what happens." The saloon fell silent except for the scrape of chairs as patrons backed away from the impending violence. Ruby's hand moved beneath the bar, reaching for a shotgun. Elijah guessed, but her eyes remained calm. What happened next surprised everyone, including Elijah himself. He found his feet moving before his mind caught up, placing himself between the 2 men. Years of breaking up church squabbles had given him an instinct for diffusing situations, even if he'd lost the words of peace that once came so easily. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise him. Whatever's in that pot ain't worth dying over, or killing over. Morrison's fist caught him square in the jaw before he could say more. Elijah staggered but didn't fall, tasting copper in his mouth. Hutchins took the distraction as an opportunity to lunge with his knife, but Elijah's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist and twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. "Enough!" Ruby's voice cracked like a whip. She stood on the bar now, a pearl-handled Colt in her hand, aimed at the ceiling but ready to drop. "Morrison, Hutchins, you're both banned for a week. Take your grievances outside my establishment." The two men glared at each other but complied, gathering their belongings and stumbling toward the door. The saloon gradually returned to its previous noise level, though many eyes lingered on the stranger who'd intervened. Elijah returned to the bar, dabbing at his split lip with his sleeve. Ruby had climbed down and was pouring him another whiskey, a better brand this time. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "I haven't decided which." "Story of my life," Elijah muttered, accepting the drink gratefully. "You're bleeding," Ruby observed. She glanced around the saloon, then made a decision. "Come on, I've got supplies in the back." She led him through a door marked "Private" into a small room that served as both office and living quarters. It was surprisingly neat, with a narrow bed, a desk covered in ledgers, and a shelf lined with books, unusual for a frontier saloon. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a wooden chair. She retrieved a basin of water and some clean cloths from a cabinet. As she worked on his lip, Elijah noticed the practiced way she tended wounds, the steady hands that had done this before. Up close, he could see the faint lines around her eyes, the weariness that her smile couldn't quite hide. She was younger than him, maybe 30, but something in her bearing spoke of hard-won experience. "You handle a gun like you've had practice," he observed. "And you break up fights like a man used to keeping the peace," she countered. "Though most peacekeepers I know carry badges or Bibles. You don't strike me as the badge type." Elijah's hand instinctively moved toward his saddlebag before he caught himself. Ruby noticed the gesture, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Used to be the Bible type," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Not anymore." "A preacher," she said, not quite a question. "That explains the intervening old habits and all that." She finished cleaning his wound and stepped back. "Well, former Reverend, you're patched up. That'll be $2 for the medical attention." "You said the drink was free." Elijah protested. "The drink was—" "The nursing wasn't," but she smiled as she said it. A real one this time that actually touched her eyes. "Though I suppose I could waive the fee if you tell me what brings a fallen preacher to Dustwood. We collect interesting stories here. They're about the only currency worth anything." Elijah considered his options. He'd come here to disappear, not to share his past with beautiful saloon keepers who saw too much. But something about Ruby Sinclair made him want to lower his guard. Just a little. "That's a long story," he said finally, "and not a particularly pleasant one. The best ones never are." Ruby replied. She poured herself a drink from the good bottle and settled into the chair across from him. "I've got time if you do. Besides, you owe me for scaring off 2 paying customers." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and bringing the smell of coming rain, rare in these parts. Elijah sipped his whiskey and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Ruby Sinclair was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the gun she carried or the secrets she clearly harbored. She was dangerous because she made him want to stop running, and that was the one thing Elijah Morgan couldn't afford to do. The morning sun crept over Dustwood like a cautious visitor, illuminating the town's scars and secrets. Elijah had found work at the livery stable, mucking stalls and mending tack for old Samuel Hayes, who asked no questions as long as the work got done. It wasn't preaching, but there was something honest about the labor, something clean despite the dirt under his fingernails. 2 weeks had passed since his arrival, and Elijah had settled into a rhythm of anonymity. He kept his head down, spoke only when necessary, and avoided the Queen's deal, though his eyes often strayed to its painted sign when he passed. Ruby Sinclair occupied his thoughts more than he cared to admit. her sharp green eyes and knowing smile haunting his restless nights. But Dustwood had a way of pulling people into its web, willing or not. "You hear about the Sinclair treasure?" Samuel asked one afternoon, spitting tobacco juice into a rusty can. "Folks say her daddy, Black Jack Sinclair, hid a fortune somewhere round these parts 'fore he died." Elijah's hand stilled on the harness he was repairing. "Just talk, I reckon. Maybe." Samuel agreed. "But talk has a way of attracting the wrong sort. Been seeing strangers in town lately, hard-looking men asking questions." That evening, Elijah's resolve to avoid the saloon crumbled. Something in Samuel's words had stirred an unease he couldn't shake. He pushed through the familiar swinging doors to find the Queen's deal unusually tense. The regular crowd was there, but they huddled closer to their drinks, voices lower than usual. Ruby stood behind the bar, her crimson dress immaculate as always. But Elijah noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way her hand never strayed far from the bar's edge where he knew she kept her shotgun. "Whiskey?" she asked when she saw him, already reaching for a glass. "Information," he replied, keeping his voice low. "There's talk about strangers in town." Her smile was brittle. "Since when does a drifter concern himself with town gossip? Since the gossip might concern a friend." "Friend?" Ruby's eyebrow arched. "That's presumptuous for a man who's been avoiding this place like it's got the plague." Before Elijah could respond, the doors burst open. 3 men entered, trail dust still clinging to their clothes, faces weathered by sun and violence. The leader, a thin man with pale eyes and a scar running from ear to chin, surveyed the room like a hawk eyeing mice. "Evening, Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Name's Cole Garrett. I believe you knew my former associate, your late father." Ruby's expression didn't change, but Elijah saw her fingers tighten on the glass she was polishing. "My father knew a lot of people, not all of them worth remembering." Garrett's companions spread out, blocking the exits. The saloon's patrons grew very still, recognizing trouble when it walked in on spurred boots. "Now that's downright unfriendly," Garrett said, moving to the bar, "especially considering we rode all this way to discuss a business matter, a matter of some outstanding debts." "My father's debts died with him," Ruby stated flatly. "Did they?" Garrett produced a piece of paper from his vest, unfolding it with theatrical care. "This here says different. A promissory note for a share of the Canyon Creek gold, signed by Black Jack himself." Ruby's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Garrett's face. "Even if that's genuine, which I doubt, there is no gold. My father died broke, leaving me nothing but this saloon and a reputation I've been trying to outlive." "See, that's where you're wrong," Garrett said, leaning closer. "Jack was many things, but broke wasn't one of them. He told us about the gold before he died, said his daughter would know where to find it. Then he lied," Ruby said simply. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Elijah shifted slightly, positioning himself better should violence erupt. He caught Ruby's eye, a silent question passing between them. "Search the place if you want," Ruby said suddenly, spreading her arms wide. "Turn it inside out. You'll find nothing but whiskey and playing cards." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then smiled, an expression that promised nothing good. "Oh, we will, but not tonight. Tonight, we're just getting reacquainted, boys." His companions moved through the saloon, helping themselves to drinks and intimidating the patrons. One of them, a giant with hands like ham hocks, deliberately knocked over a table, sending poker chips scattering. "Oops," he said, grinning to reveal several missing teeth. Ruby's jaw clenched, but she held her tongue. Garrett tipped his hat to her, a mockery of courtesy. "We'll be staying in town for a spell," he announced. "I'm sure we'll have more to discuss real soon. Evening, Miss Sinclair." They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving behind a saloon full of nervous silence. Ruby immediately moved to the door, locking it and pulling down the shade. "We're closed," she announced to the room. "Everyone out the back." The patrons filed out quickly, grateful to escape. Only Elijah remained, helping Ruby right the overturned table. "You should go too," she said without looking at him. "Those men won't stop," Elijah said. "Whatever they think you have, I don't have anything." Ruby's composure finally cracked. She sank into a chair, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "My father was a gambler and a drunk who told stories to anyone who'd listen. There's no gold, no treasure, just the fantasies of a dead man and the vultures who believed them." Elijah pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Then why are you scared?" Ruby's laugh was bitter. "Because men like Garrett don't need truth. They need someone to blame when their dreams don't pan out. And I'm convenient." She stood abruptly, moving to the window and peering through a gap in the shade. "You really should go. Association with me is about to become very unhealthy. I've been unhealthy for a while now." Elijah said, "Might as well have company." Ruby turned to look at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Why? You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me." "Maybe not," Elijah admitted. "But I know what it's like to be haunted by someone else's sins. And I know what men like Garrett do to people who can't defend themselves." "I can defend myself," Ruby said sharply. "Against 3 men, more, probably." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you proposing? Preacher?" "Stop calling me that," Elijah said. "And I'm not proposing anything, just stating facts. You need help. I need purpose. I suppose. Seems like we might be useful to each other." Ruby studied him with those penetrating green eyes. "You're not a gunfighter. That much was clear when Morrison hit you." "No," Elijah agreed. "But I've got steady hands and nothing to lose. Sometimes that's enough." The wind rattled the windows. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Ruby moved back to the bar, pouring 2 generous glasses of her good whiskey. "My father used to hide things," she said quietly. "Papers, money, sometimes just bottles. Said it was insurance. I've found most of his hidey holes over the years, but—" She trailed off, lost in thought. "But there's one place I never looked. Couldn't bring myself to." She took a long sip of whiskey. "The old cabin where I found him. After—" Elijah understood. Death had a way of making places sacred and terrible all at once. If there's any truth to this treasure talk, if he left any clue about it, it would be there. Ruby continued, "But Garrett's men will be watching, following. Then we go at night," Elijah said, quietly. Ruby looked at him again, and this time something had shifted in her expression. A decision made, perhaps, or a wall beginning to crumble. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "You still haven't decided which—" "No," she admitted. "But I suppose I'm about to find out." She stood, moving with purpose now. From beneath the bar, she produced not the shotgun but a small leather pouch. She slid it across to Elijah. "What's this?" "A down payment," Ruby said, "for whatever help you're offering, and maybe insurance of my own." Elijah opened the pouch to find several gold coins. Not a fortune, but more than he'd seen in months. "I can't—" "You can and you will," Ruby interrupted. "Because if this goes badly, I want someone to know that Ruby Sinclair paid her debts. All of them." The weight of her words settled between them. Outside, Dustwood was settling into an uneasy night, aware that something had shifted with the arrival of Garrett and his men. The town had weathered storms before, but this felt different. This felt personal. "When?" Elijah asked simply. "Tomorrow night. Meet me at the old cemetery, midnight. And preacher—" She paused, a ghost of her usual smile playing at her lips. "Bring that Bible of yours. We might need all the help we can get." As Elijah walked back to his small room above the stable, he felt the familiar weight of his Bible in his saddlebag, along with something new, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with a woman in a crimson dress who carried too many secrets and not enough hope. The wind whispered through Dustwood's empty streets, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of trouble. Somewhere in the darkness, Garrett and his men were waiting, watching, planning. But for the first time in years, Elijah Morgan wasn't running from the storm. He was walking straight into it. The midnight moon cast long shadows through the cemetery's broken gate as Elijah waited among the weathered headstones. His Bible sat heavy in his coat pocket, its worn leather cover rough against his fingers. He'd opened it earlier, trying to find comfort in familiar verses, but the words had swum before his eyes like strangers. Ruby emerged from the darkness like a specter, dressed in black riding clothes instead of her usual crimson. The change made her seem younger, more vulnerable, though the colt at her hip suggested otherwise. "You came," she said, though it wasn't really a question. "Said I would." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the hills. "It's about an hour's ride. We'll need to be back before dawn." They retrieved horses from behind the cemetery, Ruby's black mare and a sturdy gelding she'd arranged for Elijah. As they rode out into the desert night, the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness and distance. The old cabin sat in a canyon fold, barely visible until they were almost upon it. Desert winds had scoured its walls, and the roof sagged like a broken promise. Ruby dismounted but didn't immediately approach, staring at the structure as if it might bite. "I haven't been here since—" her voice trailed off. "Since you found him." Elijah finished. She nodded, jaw tight. 3 years ago, shot himself rather than face his debts, or so everyone assumed. Something in her tone made Elijah look sharper. "You don't think—" "I don't know what I think anymore," Ruby said. "But Garrett's showing up, talking about gold my father promised them. It makes me wonder what really happened that night." They entered the cabin together, Ruby lighting a lantern she'd brought. The interior was much as she'd left it, a cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with empty bottles. Dust covered everything like a shroud. "Where do we start?" Elijah asked. Ruby moved to the fireplace, running her hands along the stones. He used to hide things in the walls, said a smart man always kept his treasures where fire couldn't reach them. They searched methodically, prying at loose boards and checking for hidden compartments. An hour passed with nothing to show but splinters and dust. Ruby's frustration grew with each empty hiding spot. "Maybe there really is nothing," she said, sinking into one of the chairs. "Maybe I'm just chasing ghosts." Elijah was about to respond when something caught his eye, a pattern in the dust on the bookshelf. Most of the bottles were covered evenly, but one section showed signs of recent disturbance. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. Ruby was on her feet instantly, hand moving to her gun. Elijah examined the shelf more closely, then pulled out a bottle that sat slightly askew. Behind it was a small leather journal. "Is that your father's writing?" he asked, showing Ruby the first page. Her breath caught. "Yes, but I've never seen this before." They huddled over the journal, reading by lamplight. Most entries were mundane, poker hands won and lost, debts owed and collected. But toward the end, the tone changed. "The gold from Canyon Creek was real," Ruby read aloud. "Buried it proper, where even the devil won't find it. Maps in the last place anyone would look. The good book itself. Let those vultures circle. They'll never think Blackjack Sinclair would trust his fortune to scripture." Elijah's hand went automatically to his pocket. A Bible. He hid the map in a Bible. "But which one? Where?" Ruby's eyes were bright with possibility and fear. "The journal mentions the mission copy," Elijah noted. "There's an old Spanish mission about 10 miles north, abandoned for decades." Ruby stood abruptly. "We should go, now, while we still have darkness." But as they moved toward the door, the sound of approaching horses froze them in place. Through the dirty window, Elijah counted 3 riders. "Maybe 4. Garrett," Ruby whispered. "They must have followed us." "Back door. Leads to a cliff drop. We're trapped." Elijah's mind raced. Violence would bring more violence, and they were outnumbered. But perhaps— "Trust me," he said to Ruby, then called out, "Come on in, gentlemen. Door's open." Ruby shot him a look of pure incredulity, but Elijah was already moving, positioning himself casually by the table. He pulled out his Bible, setting it prominently in view. Garrett entered first, gun drawn, his pale eyes taking in the scene. His men followed, filling the small space with menace. "Well, well," Garrett drawled. "A midnight prayer meeting." "Something like that." Elijah replied calmly. "Miss Sinclair was showing me where her father died. Thought he might need some words said over him, even after all this time." Garrett's eyes narrowed, flicking between them. "That's so, and it couldn't wait for daylight?" "Grief doesn't keep regular hours," Ruby said, catching on to Elijah's ploy. "Neither does guilt." "Touching," Garrett said. "Find anything interesting in your grieving?" "Just dust and memories," Ruby replied. One of Garrett's men had noticed the journal on the table. "Boss?" Garrett picked it up, flipping through pages. His expression grew darker with each entry. "Seems your father had a guilty conscience, Miss Sinclair. All these debts, all these promises." He looked up sharply. "Where's the map?" "What map?" Ruby's confusion seemed genuine. She was a better actress than Elijah had expected. "Don't play dumb," Garrett snarled. "It mentions a map in a Bible. Where is it?" "That's my Bible," Elijah said. "Had it for years, nothing in it but the Word of God." Garrett grabbed the Bible, shaking it violently. Pages fluttered, but no map appeared. He threw it aside in disgust, and Elijah forced himself not to react as it hit the floor. "Search everything," Garrett ordered his men. "Tear this place apart if you have to." As they ransacked the cabin, Garrett kept his gun on Ruby and Elijah. "You know what I think? I think you already found what you were looking for. Maybe we need more persuasive methods." The giant who'd overturned the table in the saloon cracked his knuckles meaningfully. Ruby stepped closer to Elijah. Whether for protection or to protect, he wasn't sure. "Wait," Elijah said. "You're right. We found something." Ruby's hand tightened on his arm, but he continued. "Not a map, but a clue. The journal mentions the old mission. If there's anything to find, it'll be there." Garrett considered this. "Show me the passage." Elijah pointed it out, watching Garrett read. The scar-faced man's expression grew calculating. "All right then," he decided. "We'll all take a little ride to the mission, and if you're lying, preacher, you'll be meeting your maker sooner than expected." They filed out of the cabin, Garrett's men keeping weapons trained on their captives. As Elijah bent to retrieve his Bible from the floor, something made him look closer. The spine had split slightly from the impact, revealing a thin edge of paper tucked inside the binding. His heart hammered as he carefully closed the book and pocketed it. Ruby caught his eye, a question in her gaze. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not now, not yet. The ride to the mission was tense, Garrett's men boxing them in. Ruby rode close to Elijah, and he could feel the questions radiating from her. The mission ruins appeared as the eastern sky began to lighten, ancient adobe walls crumbling back to earth, a bell tower standing sentinel against time. "Where's this Bible your father mentioned?" Garrett demanded. Ruby dismounted, moving toward the chapel. "The altar, probably, if any books survived." Inside, the mission was a hollow shell. The altar remained, carved stone defying decay, but little else. Garrett's men spread out, searching, while their leader kept his attention on his prisoners. "Nothing here, boss," one reported. "Place has been picked clean." Garrett's face darkened. "You've wasted my time." "The journal said," Ruby began. "The journal said what you wanted me to hear." Garrett cut her off. He nodded to his men. "Take them outside. Time to end this treasure hunt." As they were marched out, Elijah's mind raced. The paper in his Bible might be nothing, might be everything. Either way, they were about to die for gold that might not exist. The sunrise painted the desert red as Garrett's men forced them to their knees. Ruby reached for Elijah's hand, her fingers cold but steady. "Any last words?" "Preacher," Garrett asked, checking his weapon. "This is your moment?" Elijah looked at the sunrise, at Ruby beside him, at the gun aimed at his head. For the first time in years, words came, not scripture, but truth. "I used to believe in redemption," he said quietly. "Lost that faith when I lost everything else. But maybe Maybe it finds us when we stop looking. Maybe it comes in forms we don't expect. He squeezed Ruby's hand, feeling her squeeze back. Whatever happened next, at least he wasn't alone. At least he'd found something worth protecting in this desolate place. Garrett raised his gun. Pretty words. Too bad no one will remember them. The shot, when it came, echoed across the desert like thunder. But it wasn't Garrett's gun that fired. A rifle cracked from the mission tower, and one of Garrett's men crumpled. More shots followed as riders burst from behind the ruins, townsfolk from Dustwood, led by Samuel Hayes and the widow McKenna, guns blazing. In the chaos, Ruby rolled aside, pulling a hidden derringer from her boot and firing at Garrett. He cursed and dove for cover as the morning exploded into violence. When the dust settled, 2 of Garrett's men were dead, 1 wounded, and Garrett himself had vanished into the desert, blood trailing from Ruby's shot. "Thought you might need help," Samuel said, spitting tobacco juice onto the sand. "Whole town saw you leave, figured trouble was brewing." Ruby stood on shaking legs, helping Elijah up. "How did you know to come here?" The widow McKenna smiled grimly. "Your father helped my girl once when she was sick. Figured I owed the debt. Besides, Garrett's been terrorizing towns from here to Texas. About time someone stood up to him." As the townspeople dealt with the aftermath, Ruby pulled Elijah aside. "Your Bible, I saw you notice something." Elijah pulled out the book, carefully working the paper free from the split binding. It was indeed a map, drawn in fading ink, marking a spot in the hills with an X. "Do you want to know?" he asked Ruby. "Want to find out if it's real?" She looked at the map for a long moment, then at him. "You know what? No, let it stay buried. Real or not, that gold has brought nothing but death and sorrow. I'd rather have—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "What?" Elijah prompted gently. "I'd rather have something real," she finished. "Something that doesn't come with ghosts attached." As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold more valuable than any metal, Elijah folded the map and tucked it back in his Bible. Some treasures were meant to be found. Others were better left buried. The day after the mission showdown dawned gray and restless, matching the mood that had settled over Dustwood. Ruby moved through the Queen's deal like a ghost, serving drinks with mechanical precision while her mind churned with questions. The map hidden in Elijah's Bible gnawed at her thoughts like a persistent ache. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor," Martha McKenna observed from her corner table, nursing a coffee liberally laced with whiskey. Ruby forced a smile. "Just thinking. About that preacher of yours? He's not my anything," Ruby said automatically, then caught Martha's knowing look. "And I'm thinking about the fact that Garrett's still out there, wounded or not. He'll be back." Martha nodded slowly. "Men like that don't give up easy. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Ruby could answer, the saloon doors opened and Elijah entered. He'd cleaned up from their desert adventure, but exhaustion lined his face. Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. "We need to talk," he said simply. Ruby glanced around the nearly empty saloon, then nodded toward the back room. Once inside, she turned to face him, arms crossed defensively. "If you're here to convince me to go after that gold—" "I'm not," Elijah interrupted. "I'm here because we need to settle this. All of it." He pulled out his Bible, extracting the map. "This has been eating at you. I can see it." "I said I didn't want to know," Ruby insisted, but her eyes remained fixed on the yellowed paper. "You said that in the heat of the moment, but secrets have a way of festering." Elijah spread the map on her desk. "Your father drew this. These are his marks, his mountains. Don't you want to know what he thought was worth dying for?" Ruby sank into her chair, suddenly looking very tired. "What if it's real? What if there really is gold out there? Then we decide what to do with it, together." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Ruby traced the map's lines with one finger, recognizing landmarks despite the years. "Devil's Canyon," she murmured. "He used to take me camping there when I was young. Before She shook her head. That's at least a day's ride, through rough country. When do we leave? Elijah asked. Ruby looked up sharply. We? You think I'd let you go alone? Garrett's men could be watching. Besides, he added with a slight smile, someone needs to keep you from doing something reckless. That's rich, coming from the man who stepped between two knife fighters. They prepared quietly, gathering supplies under cover of normal business. Ruby told everyone she was visiting a sick friend in the next town. Elijah simply disappeared from his stable job, leaving a note for Samuel. They left Dustwood as the moon set, taking a circuitous route to avoid any watchers. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, broken only by scattered mesas and dried creek beds. They rode in companionable silence, each lost in thought. As the sun climbed higher, they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a massive boulder. Ruby pulled out her canteen, then surprised Elijah by asking, "Tell me about your family, the ones you lost." Elijah stiffened, but something in her tone, not demanding, just open, made him answer. Sarah she was everything good I didn't deserve, made me want to be better than I was. And Matthew, our son, he had her smile, her faith. How did it happen? Fire, Elijah said shortly. Someone had a grudge against my preaching, thought I was too harsh about sin and judgment. They waited until I was away. Then he couldn't finish. Ruby reached out, touching his hand briefly. That's why you stopped believing? Because God didn't protect them? Because I didn't protect them. Elijah corrected. I was so busy saving other souls, I couldn't save the ones that mattered most. They resumed riding as the afternoon heat grew oppressive. The landscape changed, becoming rougher, more vertical. By evening, they'd reached the mouth of Devil's Canyon, a gash in the earth that looked like its name. We'll camp here, Ruby decided. Navigate the canyon at first light. They made a simple camp, sharing dried beef and biscuit. As darkness fell, the desert came alive with sounds, coyotes, nightbirds, the whisper of wind through stone. My mother died when I was 12, Ruby said suddenly, staring into their small fire. Consumption. Father started drinking more after that, gambling more. Said he was trying to win enough for a fresh start somewhere else. But the debts just kept growing. Is that when he started hiding money? Ruby nodded. Trust nobody. He'd say, not banks, not partners, not even family. Keep your treasures where only you can find them. She laughed bitterly. Turns out he hid them so well, even he forgot in the end. Or maybe he remembered exactly, Elijah suggested. Maybe he left that map for you to find when you were ready. Ready for what? To choose your own path, to stop living in his shadow. Ruby looked at him across the fire, its light dancing in her green eyes. Is that what you're doing? Choosing a new path? Trying to, Elijah admitted. Some days are better than others. The tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly crystallized in the desert silence. Ruby stood, moving around the fire to sit beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, see the fine lines that worry had etched beside her eyes. This is probably a mistake, she said softly. Probably. Elijah agreed, but he was already turning toward her. Their kiss was desperate and tender at once, full of loneliness seeking solace and souls recognizing kinship. Ruby's hands tangled in his hair while his arms pulled her closer, as if they could hold back all the darkness through sheer will. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ruby laughed shakily. Well, that complicates things. Everything about this is complicated. Elijah said, might as well add one more layer. They came together again, this time slower, more deliberate. The desert night wrapped around them as they found comfort in each other. Two damaged people creating something whole, if only for a moment. Their joining was passionate, yet tinged with sadness, as if they both knew that dawn would bring back all the reasons this couldn't last. Afterward, they lay entwined under the vast canopy of stars. Ruby traced the scar on Elijah's shoulder, another story of violence and survival. What happens when we find it? She asked. The gold, if it's there? I don't know. Elijah answered honestly. But whatever we decide together. Together, Ruby repeated, testing the word. I haven't had it together in a long time. Neither have I. They dozed fitfully, taking turns keeping watch. As dawn approached, Elijah woke to find Ruby already up, studying the map by the dying firelight. I know where it is, she said without preamble. There's a cave system about halfway up the canyon. We used to shelter there during storms. If Father hid anything, it would be there. They broke camp quickly, both aware that last night had changed things between them, but unsure how to acknowledge it in daylight. The canyon walls rose around them as they entered, red rock striated with centuries of geological history. The climb to the caves was treacherous, requiring them to lead the horses through narrow switchbacks and loose shale. By the time they reached the entrance, the sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly. This is it, Ruby said, peering into the darkness. Are you ready for this? Elijah lit a torch, the flames throwing dancing shadows on the cave walls. Are you? They entered together, the temperature dropping dramatically in the cave's embrace. The passage wound back into the mountain, branching occasionally into side chambers. Ruby led confidently, memory guiding her steps. Here, she said finally, stopping in a circular chamber. This is where we used to camp. They searched methodically, looking for any sign of disturbance or hidden cache. It was Elijah who noticed the pile of rocks in one corner looked too orderly to be natural. Working together, they shifted the stones, revealing a wooden crate wrapped in oilcloth. Ruby's hands shook as she cut through the bindings. Inside were leather pouches, heavy with promise. She opened one, and gold coins spilled into her palm, gleaming in the torchlight. Not a fortune by Eastern standards, perhaps, but enough to change lives in a place like Dustwood. It's real, she whispered. He wasn't lying. The question is, Elijah said carefully, what now? Ruby looked at the gold, then at him, in her face. He could see the war between old dreams and new possibilities, between the life she'd imagined and the one taking shape before her. I used to think this would solve everything, she said slowly, that enough money would wash away the past, make me respectable. But respectability's just another cage, isn't it? It can be, Elijah agreed. Or it can be freedom. Depends on how you use it. Ruby began putting the gold back in its pouches, her movements decisive. Then we use it smart. Some for the town. Martha's been trying to start a school. Some for us, to build something real. And some, she smiled grimly. Some we use to make sure Garrett and his kind think twice before coming back. You've given this thought. I've had years to think about it. Just never believed it would happen. She stood, dusting off her hands. Help me load this. We've got a long ride back. As they worked together in the cave's cool darkness, Elijah felt something shift inside him. Not faith exactly, that would take longer to rebuild, but hope. The possibility that broken things could be mended, that second chances were real. They emerged from the cave to find the sun beginning its western descent. The gold was distributed between their saddlebags, its weight a reminder of choices yet to be made. No regrets? Elijah asked as they prepared to descend. Ruby looked back at the cave, then at him. Ask me in a year, when we see what we've built with it. We, Elijah noted. I like the sound of that. Don't get too comfortable, preacher, Ruby warned, but her smile took the sting from the words. This doesn't mean I'm going to start attending services. Wouldn't expect you to, Elijah said. But maybe you'll let me practice my sermons on you. I'm thinking of taking up preaching again. Different this time. Less judgment, more grace. Grace, Ruby repeated. I could maybe listen to that. They began the careful descent, the gold weighing down their horses, but their spirits somehow lighter. Behind them, the cave kept its silence, no longer hoarding secrets. And ahead, Dustwood waited, unaware that its two most damaged souls had found something precious in the desert, not just gold, but the rarer treasure of connection, of possibility, of a future worth fighting for. The morning sun cast long shadows through the abandoned church's broken windows as Elijah stood before the dusty pulpit, His fingers traced the worn wood. Memories flooding back of countless sermons delivered with fire and certainty. That man felt like a stranger now. 3 weeks had passed since their return from Devil's Canyon. The gold remained hidden, split between several caches Ruby had devised. They'd been careful, changing nothing outwardly, but Elijah could feel the town's growing tension. Garrett might be gone, but his shadow lingered. "Never thought I'd see you in here again." Elijah turned to find Samuel Hayes in the doorway, hat in hand despite the church's state of disrepair. "Just thinking," Elijah replied. "About preaching again? Town could use it. Been too long since anyone spoke words of comfort around here." "I'm not sure I remember how to comfort," Elijah admitted. "Spent too many years condemning." Samuel spat tobacco juice through a gap in the floorboards. "Maybe that's what makes you the right man now. You know what it's like to fall. Makes the climbing back up mean something." After Samuel left, Elijah remained, wrestling with the call he felt returning. Not the old fire and brimstone, but something gentler. Something that acknowledged the broken places in everyone. He was still there when Ruby found him, her face tight with worry. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Jake Morrison just rode in from Copper Falls. Says there's talk of Garrett gathering men. A small army? Jake called it." Elijah's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Week, maybe 2. Jake says Garrett's promising them a share of Blackjack's treasure. Says he knows for certain it exists." They walked back toward town together, the weight of decision heavy between them. As they passed the schoolhouse construction site, Martha McKenna's project, funded by anonymous donation, children's laughter rang out from the temporary classroom. "We could run," Ruby said quietly. "Take what we can carry and disappear. Start fresh somewhere Garrett can't find us." "Is that what you want?" Ruby watched the children playing. "Would have been once, now." She gestured at the slowly transforming town. "We've started something here. These people stood up for us. How can we abandon them?" That evening, Elijah called a town meeting in the Queensdeal. The saloon filled with worried faces, shopkeepers, miners, families who'd made Dustwood home despite its reputation. "Most of you know Cole Garrett's coming back," Elijah began, standing where he'd once broken up the poker fight. "He wants something he thinks we have. He won't stop until he gets it or dies trying." "So give it to him," suggested Tom Brennan, the banker. "Whatever it is, it ain't worth dying for. And when he's done with us, he'll move to the next town," Martha countered. "Men like Garrett are never satisfied. Today it's treasure. Tomorrow it's your business, your land, your daughters." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "What are you proposing, preacher?" asked Doc Holcomb, the town's aging physician. Elijah glanced at Ruby, drawing strength from her presence. "We make a stand. Here, together. Turn Dustwood into a place men like Garrett learned to avoid." "With what army?" Brennan scoffed. "We're merchants and miners, not gunfighters." "David was a shepherd," Elijah replied, surprising himself by reaching for scripture. "Sometimes that's enough, if the cause is just." The debate continued late into the night. Some argued for appeasement, others for flight. But gradually, led by Martha's fierce advocacy and the quiet testimonies of those Ruby had helped over the years, opinions shifted. "All right," said Henry Chen, the Chinese launderer who rarely spoke at meetings. "I have known men like Garrett in California. They take everything, leave nothing. Here, I have business, friends, worth fighting for." By meeting's end, they had the beginnings of a plan. Those who could shoot would drill. Fortifications would be built. The children and those unwilling to fight would be evacuated to neighboring towns. Over the following days, Dustwood transformed. Under Elijah's direction, they turned buildings into defensive positions, created kill zones in the streets, cached weapons and ammunition. Ruby coordinated supplies and intelligence, her network of contacts proving invaluable. But the preparation took its toll. At night, when the work stopped, doubt crept in. Elijah found himself in the church again, this time with Ruby beside him. "I'm scared," she admitted in the darkness. Not of dying, of surviving but losing everything we've built, of watching good people die for someone else's greed. Elijah pulled her close. Fear's not weakness. It's what makes courage mean something. Is that from the Bible? No, that's from living through hell and finding reasons to keep going. She turned in his arms, moonlight illuminating her face. Am I one of those reasons? The main one, he said simply. Their kiss was different this time, less desperate, more certain. When they came together, it was with the knowledge that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. But that made the present more precious. In the abandoned church where Elijah had once preached certainty, they found grace in uncertainty, salvation in each other's arms. Morning came too soon, bringing a dust cloud on the eastern horizon. A rider approached under a white flag, one of Garrett's men, carrying terms. "Mister, Garrett offers you a choice," the messenger announced to the assembled townspeople. "Surrender the Sinclair woman and the gold, and he'll spare the town. Resist, and he'll burn Dustwood to the ground. Tell Garrett he can go to hell." Martha spoke up before anyone else could respond. "And take his terms with him." The messenger's eyes hardened. "You have until sundown to reconsider. After that, may God have mercy on you all." God's mercy is why we're standing up to bullies like Garrett, Elijah said quietly. "Tell your boss that Dustwood has found its spine. If he wants a fight, we'll give him one." After the messenger left, final preparations began in earnest. Those leaving town loaded wagons. Tearful goodbyes mixing with determined preparation. Ruby distributed the hidden gold among the defenders, not as payment, but as trust. "If we survive, we rebuild together," she announced. "If we don't, at least you'll have something to leave your families." Doc Holcomb set up a makeshift hospital in the most protected building. Women who'd chosen to stay prepared bandages and bullets with equal efficiency. Even some of the older children refused evacuation, determined to help however they could. As afternoon wore on, Elijah found himself standing before the town, words coming unbidden. Not a sermon exactly, but something needful. "I used to preach about sin and punishment," he began. "Thought I knew exactly where the lines were drawn. Then I lost everything and learned that lines blur when you're desperate. That good people do bad things, and bad people sometimes show grace." He looked at the faces before him, scared but determined. Ordinary folks ready to become extraordinary. "Tonight we fight not for gold or glory, but for the right to live free from fear, for the chance to build something better than what we were. That's worth standing for. That's worth bleeding for." "Amen," someone called out, and others took it up. Not a religious cry, but an affirmation of shared purpose. As the sun began its descent, Elijah climbed to the church bell tower with his rifle. From here, he could see Garrett's force approaching. 20 men, maybe more, too many for a straight fight. But perhaps Ruby appeared beside him, carrying her father's Winchester. "Quite a congregation you've gathered, preacher. Never thought my flock would be carrying guns instead of Bibles." "Maybe sometimes they're the same thing," Ruby said, "tools for protecting what matters." The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert red. In the distance, Garrett's men spread out, beginning their approach. Somewhere below, a child who'd refused to leave began singing a hymn in a clear, young voice. Others joined in, the melody rising into the evening air. Elijah checked his rifle, said a prayer he wasn't sure anyone would hear, and prepared to defend this imperfect paradise they'd begun to build. Beside him, Ruby did the same, her presence a benediction worth more than any gold. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know." "I know," Elijah interrupted gently. "Me too." The first shot rang out as the sun died, and the battle for Dustwood began. In the church tower, a fallen preacher and a gambler's daughter stood together, ready to write their own scripture in gunpowder and courage, in love and lead. The night would be long, the cost high, but for the first time in years, Elijah Morgan knew exactly where he belonged. Not in a pulpit preaching perfection, but in the mess and mud of human struggle, fighting for something real alongside someone who'd shown him that redemption came in many forms. Below them, Dustwood prepared to earn its future with blood and bullets, hope and determination. And in the bell tower, two broken souls who'd found each other prepared to see if love could outlast the coming storm. The first wave came at full dark, Garrett's men advancing behind makeshift shields, their torches turning the night hellish. From the bell tower, Elijah picked his targets carefully, each shot deliberate. Beside him, Ruby worked her Winchester with deadly grace, her face set in grim determination. "Northwest corner," she called out, and Elijah swung his rifle to cover a group trying to flank their defenses. Below, the town erupted in controlled chaos. Martha McKenna commanded the eastern barricade with surprising military efficiency, while Henry Chen had turned his laundry into a fortress, steam from his boilers creating concealment for the defenders. The first building to burn was the old assay office, torched by raiders who'd slipped through. The flames spread to the neighboring structure as townspeople formed bucket brigades, fighting fire and invaders simultaneously. "They're trying to smoke us out," Ruby observed, reloading swiftly. Through the smoke and darkness, Elijah spotted Garrett himself, hanging back, directing his men like chess pieces. The scar Ruby had given him showed pale in the firelight. A scream from below. Young Tom Sawyer, the blacksmith's apprentice, fell clutching his shoulder. Doc Holcomb's assistants dragged him to safety as the gap in their defense threatened to widen. "Cover me," Elijah said, making for the ladder. "Where are you going?" "To plug that hole." He descended into madness. The peaceful town transformed into a battlefield. Bodies lay in the street, some moving, some still. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke as Elijah ran toward the breach. Samuel Hayes was already there, his old shotgun booming as he held the line alone. Elijah slid into position beside him, firing at shadows in the smoke. "About time you showed up, preacher," Samuel grunted. "Was starting to think I'd have to save this town myself." More defenders arrived, stabilizing the line, but the cost was mounting. Elijah saw Jake Morrison fall. The man who'd warned them of Garrett's approach misses. Patterson from the general store took a bullet meant for a fleeing child. The battle raged for hours, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Garrett's superior numbers met Dustwood's superior position and determination, but ammunition ran low, and exhaustion crept in. Then came the explosion. Ruby's trap, barrels of whiskey turned into crude bombs, detonated as raiders tried to storm the Queen's Deal. The blast shattered windows throughout downtown, raining glass and splinters. Several of Garrett's men simply ceased to exist. In the momentary stunned silence that followed, Elijah heard Ruby's voice from the tower. "That's for trying to burn my town, you bastards!" The explosion marked a turning point. Garrett's men, seeing their numbers depleted and facing fiercer resistance than expected, began to waver. Some slipped away into the darkness, deciding no treasure was worth this hell. But Garrett himself pushed forward, leading a final desperate assault on the church. Perhaps he'd figured out that's where the defenders' leaders were. Perhaps he just wanted Ruby dead for the scar she'd given him. Elijah met them in the churchyard, among the weathered headstones, his rifle empty. He drew the Navy Colt he'd taken to carrying. Around him, the last defenders formed a ragged line. Samuel, Martha, Doc Holcomb with a pistol he held like a foreign object. "Give us the woman and the gold," Garrett shouted. "This doesn't have to end with everyone dead." "The only death tonight will be yours if you don't turn back," Elijah replied, surprised by the steel in his own voice. Garrett laughed, an ugly sound. "You, a washed-up preacher playing hero? I've killed better men than you for breakfast." "Maybe," Elijah conceded. But they weren't protecting anything worth dying for. The final assault was brutal and brief. Garrett's remaining men charged, and the churchyard became a close-quarters nightmare. Elijah fought with desperate efficiency, the Colt bucking in his hand. He saw Samuel go down, still swinging his empty shotgun like a club. Martha screamed defiance as she fired her last rounds. Then Garrett himself was there, his gun aimed at Elijah's head. Time slowed as Elijah saw his death in the man's pale eyes. The knife took Garrett in the throat, thrown with lethal precision. He dropped, gurgling, revealing Ruby standing behind him, another blade already in her hand. "Nobody threatens my town," she said coldly. "Or my preacher." The last of Garrett's men broke and ran, leaving their leader dying in the dust. The battle was over, but at terrible cost. As dawn broke over Dustwood, the survivors emerged to count their dead and wounded. 7 townspeople had died defending their home. Dozens were wounded. Half the main street lay in smoking ruins, but they had held. They had won. Elijah found himself pressed into service not as a fighter but as a minister, speaking words over the dead. He faltered at first, the old phrases feeling hollow. Then Ruby took his hand, and he found new words, honest ones about courage and sacrifice, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. "They died free," he concluded. "They died protecting what they loved. There's no better epitaph than that." In the days that followed, Dustwood buried its dead and began rebuilding. The gold Ruby and Elijah had hidden funded much of the reconstruction, but it was the shared sacrifice that truly bound the town together. Martha McKenna, bandaged but unbowed, established a memorial in the churchyard. Henry Chen expanded his business, hiring those widowed by the battle. Doc Holcomb, energized by his first gunfight at 70, started training assistants to handle the growing town's medical needs, but it was the church that saw the most dramatic change. The townspeople, without being asked, began repairing it. New pews appeared, donated by grateful families. The bell, silent for so long, was cleaned and rehung. "They expect you to preach," Ruby told Elijah one evening as they stood before the rebuilt pulpit. "I know. Will you?" Elijah considered the question. Not like before, no fire and brimstone, just truth, that we're all broken, that we all need grace, that sometimes salvation comes through standing together against the darkness. I'd listen to that sermon. Ruby admitted, "Even if it means sitting in a church? You said you'd never—" "I said a lot of things before I met a preacher who'd fight for me." Ruby interrupted. "Before I found something worth believing in." The first service in the restored church drew everyone who could walk. Elijah stood before them, no longer the rigid man who'd once preached perfection. His sermon was simple, about finding light in darkness, about the courage of ordinary people, about grace found in unexpected places. He spoke of loss and redemption, of second chances and the family you choose. And when he looked at Ruby in the front row, Ruby who'd never set foot in a church willingly, he spoke of love that transcended past sins and future fears. After the service, as people filed out murmuring approval, Ruby lingered. "So what now? Preacher?" she asked. "You've got your church back, your calling. Where does that leave us?" Elijah pulled her close. "There in the sanctuary where violence had given way to peace, it leaves us building something together. If you'll have me, broken pieces and all." "I run a saloon," Ruby reminded him. "I've done things no preacher's wife should have done." "Good thing I'm not looking for a preacher's wife, then," Elijah said. "I'm looking for a partner, someone who knows that grace isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to stand and fight for what matters." Ruby kissed him then, in the church where he'd found his faith again, not the rigid faith of his youth, but something tested by fire and strengthened by love. Outside, Dustwood continued its transformation. The scars of battle would always remain, but they'd become part of the town's story, proof that some things were worth fighting for. And in the church where a fallen preacher had found redemption in a gambler's daughter's eyes, 2 souls prepared to write their next chapter together. The gold that had brought so much death had funded new life. The violence that had threatened to destroy had instead forged unbreakable bonds. And in the heart of it all, love had bloomed in the most unlikely soil, wild and untamed as the frontier itself, but strong enough to weather any storm. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a well-dressed courier who looked distinctly out of place in Dustwood's dusty streets. Ruby signed for it with ink-stained fingers. Having spent the morning reviewing the saloon's books, the return address made her blood run cold. Harrison and Associates, San Francisco. She found Elijah in the church, preparing his sermon for Sunday. 3 months had passed since the battle, and he'd settled into his new role, part minister, part town defender, full-time partner to the most notorious woman in the territory. "We have a problem," she said, handing him the letter. Elijah read quickly, his expression darkening. "They want to buy the Queen's deal. They want to buy the whole damn town," Ruby corrected. "Harrison and Associates represents the railroad. They're planning a line through here, and they'd rather deal with one owner than dozens." The offer was generous, enough for Ruby to live comfortably for the rest of her life, enough to start fresh somewhere respectable, where no one knew her father's name or her own past. "What do you want to do?" Elijah asked carefully. Ruby sank into a pew, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know. Part of me—" She struggled with the words. "Part of me wants to take it, run, become someone new. And the other part? The other part thinks about Martha's school, about Henry's family, about all the people who bled for this place." She looked up at him. "About us. What we've built here." Word of the offer spread quickly. By evening, the Queen's deal was packed with worried townspeople. The railroad's interest meant prosperity for some, displacement for others. Arguments broke out between those who wanted to sell and those determined to stay. "Progress is coming whether we like it or not," argued banker Brennan. "Better to profit from it than be crushed by it." "Progress?" Martha's voice cut through the noise. "You mean the kind that turns communities into company towns, that brings in workers who'll drive out families who've been here for generations?" Ruby stood behind the bar, watching the town tear itself apart. These people had stood together against Garrett, but the promise of easy money was proving a more insidious enemy. "What do you think, preacher?" someone called out. "You've been awful quiet." Elijah rose slowly. I think every person here has to decide what their home is worth, not in dollars, but in life, in meaning, in the chance to build something that matters." "Easy for you to say." Brennan shot back. "You've got the church. The railroad won't touch that." "Won't they?" Elijah challenged. "Once they own everything else, how long before they decide the land under the church is too valuable for worship?" The meeting broke up without resolution, neighbors eyeing each other with new suspicion. Ruby closed early, she and Elijah retreating to her rooms above the saloon. "Maybe we should take it," she said quietly, staring out at the town they'd fought to save. "Maybe it's time to move on." "Is that what you want?" Ruby turned to face him. "I want to stop running, stop hiding, stop being Blackjack's daughter, or the saloon woman, or the girl with a past. I want to just be me." "And who is that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm starting to think I need to leave Dustwood to find out." The words hung between them like a blade. Elijah felt the careful life they'd built beginning to crack. "And us?" he asked finally. "Come with me," Ruby said suddenly, urgently. "We could go anywhere. San Francisco, Chicago, hell, even Boston. You could preach in a real church. I could, I don't know, be a proper wife. Learn to host tea parties or whatever it is respectable women do." Elijah crossed to her, taking her hands. "Ruby Sinclair hosting tea parties? I could learn," she insisted, but even she heard the desperation in her voice. "You could," Elijah agreed. "But would you still be the woman who stood off Cole Garrett? Who threw a knife to save my life? Who turned a den of sin into a place where the whole town gathers? Maybe I don't want to be that woman anymore. Or maybe you're afraid the world outside won't let you be her." Ruby pulled away, anger flashing in her eyes. "Don't preach to me, Elijah. Not about this. I'm not preaching. I'm reminding you who you are, the bravest woman I've ever known. The woman who taught me that redemption isn't about running from your past. It's about building something better despite it." "Fine words," Ruby said bitterly. "But the railroad doesn't care about redemption. They care about profit. And they'll get this town one way or another." Over the next days, pressure mounted. The railroad sent representatives, smooth-talking men in city suits who promised prosperity while hinting at the alternative. Several families accepted buyouts, packing up memories along with possessions. Ruby received increasingly generous offers, each accompanied by veiled threats about what would happen if she refused. The stress showed in her sleepless nights, her distracted manner, the way she flinched when anyone entered the saloon. Then came news that changed everything. Samuel Hayes, old Samuel who'd survived the battle only to struggle with his injuries, died in his sleep. At his funeral, his widow handed Ruby a letter. "He said to give you this if the vultures ever came circling," she explained. Ruby read the letter that night, tears streaming down her face, in shaky handwriting. Samuel had penned his thoughts about home, about courage, about the family you choose. At the bottom, he'd added, "Don't let them take what we bled for, girl. You're stronger than your doubts." The next morning, Ruby made her decision. She gathered the remaining townspeople in the church, standing where Elijah usually preached. "I'm refusing the railroad's offer," she announced. "The Queen's deal stays in Dustwood, and Dustwood stays free. They'll destroy you." Brennan warned. "They have lawyers, influence, and we have each other." Ruby interrupted. "We've faced worse than lawyers. We've faced men with guns who wanted to take everything. These men use paper instead of bullets, but they're no different." Martha stood first. "If Ruby's staying, so am I." One by one, others rose. Not everyone. Some had already decided to take the money and run, but enough. Enough to make a stand. The railroad tried everything. Legal challenges to property titles, hired thugs causing accidents, economic pressure as suppliers suddenly refused credit. But Dustwood had learned resilience in fire, and they held firm. Elijah watched Ruby transform during those battles. The uncertainty fell away, replaced by the fierce determination he'd first seen. She organized the resistance, found lawyers of their own, rallied nearby towns facing similar pressure. "You were right," she told him one night, exhausted but victorious after winning a key legal battle. "I was running from myself more than anything. And now I know who I am. Ruby Sinclair, owner of the Queen's deal, citizen of Dustwood, partner to a preacher who fights as hard as he prays." She smiled. "Think you can live with that?" "Already am," Elijah said, pulling her close. The railroad eventually built their line, but it curved around Dustwood rather than through it. The town grew anyway, on its own terms. Some called it stubbornness, others called it integrity. At the celebration marking the railroad's defeat, held naturally in the Queen's deal, Ruby stood before her community, her family, and raised a glass. "To Samuel Hayes," she said, "to all who stood and fought, to the town that wouldn't die, and to the future we'll build together." As the cheers erupted, Elijah caught her eye across the room. In it, he saw no more doubt, no more desire to run. Just Ruby. Complicated, fierce, uncompromising Ruby. Exactly where she belonged. The offer from San Francisco still lay in her desk drawer, a reminder of the road not taken. Sometimes she looked at it, wondering about the life she might have had, but then she'd hear laughter from the saloon, see children playing in streets their parents had died defending, feel Elijah's steady presence beside her, and know she'd made the right choice. Dustwood had given her a past to overcome, but more importantly, it had given her a future to build. And Ruby Sinclair had never backed down from a construction project. Whether it involved wood and nails or hearts and hopes, the railroad money would have made her rich. But staying had made her whole. And in a frontier where so many were broken by the vastness and violence, that was worth more than all the gold her father had ever hidden. The spring rain fell softly on Dustwood, washing the dust from the streets and bringing the desert briefly to life with wildflowers. Ruby stood at the window of the Queen's deal, watching the transformation with eyes that had seen too many seasons change. The letter in her hand trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from something closer to hope. "Well?" Martha asked from behind her. "Don't keep an old woman in suspense." Ruby turned, a smile breaking across her face. "She's coming, my cousin Elizabeth from Denver. Says she's tired of city life and wants to see what kind of place could tame the notorious Ruby Sinclair." It had been a year since the railroad battle. Dustwood had settled into a rhythm of growth and stability that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of Garrett's siege. The Queen's Deal still served whiskey and hosted card games, but it had also become the unofficial town hall, the place where decisions were made and community was forged. "When?" Martha pressed. "Next month. Spring wedding," she says, "if I'm really serious about this preacher of mine." The news of Ruby and Elijah's engagement had surprised no one but themselves. It had happened quietly, naturally, like dawn breaking. One day they simply knew that whatever future they faced, they'd face it together. Elijah found her that evening in the cemetery, placing fresh flowers on Samuel Hayes' grave. The old man's marker stood among too many others, friends and neighbors who'd paid the ultimate price for Dustwood's freedom. "Heard you got a letter," he said, taking her hand. "Elizabeth's coming. Wants to meet the man who finally got me to consider respectability." "You were never going to be respectable," Elijah said fondly. "Just yourself. That's better." They walked among the graves, each one a story, a sacrifice, a reason why leaving had become impossible. At a new stone, Tom Sawyer, the blacksmith's apprentice who died in the battle, someone had left a horseshoe, polished to shine. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruby asked suddenly. "Staying? Fighting? You could have had a quiet church somewhere safe." "Safety's overrated." Elijah replied, "Besides, quiet churches don't usually come with saloon-owning partners who can throw knives and organize town defenses." "Former saloon-owning," Ruby corrected. "I'm selling Martha my share, keeping a small interest, but she'll run the day-to-day." Elijah stopped walking. "You're selling the Queen's Deal." "Not selling out," Ruby clarified quickly. "Just changing. The school needs a full-time teacher. Martha's been hinting that I'd be good at it." She laughed, slightly embarrassed. "Me, teaching children. Can you imagine?" "Yes," Elijah said simply. "I can." The wedding date approached with the usual frontier mixture of excitement and chaos. Elizabeth arrived on the stage, a proper Denver lady who took one look at Dustwood and declared it perfectly savage. But she warmed to the townspeople quickly, especially after hearing the stories of the battle. "So you're the preacher who corrupted my cousin," she said to Elijah over dinner at Martha's house. "Other way round, I'm afraid." Elijah replied, "She taught me that salvation comes in unexpected packages." "Good," Elizabeth declared. "Ruby never did anything the conventional way. Why should marriage be different?" The wedding day dawned clear and bright. The church, their church, built from ashes and hope, filled with everyone who could walk. Ruby had chosen a dress of deep burgundy rather than white, declaring that white would be hypocritical, and I'm done with hypocrisy. Henry Chen's wife had woven flowers into Ruby's hair. Doc Holcomb, now training his third apprentice, served as Elijah's best man. Martha, naturally, gave the bride away, having declared that someone has to make sure this actually happens. As Ruby walked down the aisle, Elijah saw their whole journey in her eyes. The wariness of their first meeting, the desperation of the gold hunt, the fierce joy of battle survived, the quiet moments of building something lasting. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was present, real, no longer running from shadows. The ceremony was simple, the vows heartfelt. When Elijah spoke of finding grace in unexpected places, several hardened frontier folk dabbed at their eyes. When Ruby promised to stand beside him in pulpit and in peril, Martha openly wept. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Elijah's friend, a traveling minister, declared, "And may God help anyone who tries to come between them." The celebration spilled from the church into the streets. The Queen's Deal flowed with good whiskey and better stories. Children who'd been born since the battle played among adults who bore scars from it, the past and future of Dustwood mingling in joyous chaos. As evening approached, Ruby and Elijah slipped away to the cemetery. At Samuel's grave, Ruby left her bouquet. "He'd have loved this," she said. "Seeing the town like this, seeing us like this, he knew." Elijah replied, "Even when we didn't, he knew." They stood there as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did in a place like Dustwood. But tonight, they had each other and a community forged in fire and faith. "Any regrets?" Elijah asked, echoing her earlier question. Ruby turned in his arms, still in her burgundy dress, flowers wilting in her hair, more beautiful than any proper bride had a right to be. "Just one," she said. Elijah's heart skipped. "What?" "That it took us so long to get here." She smiled, that fierce, uncompromising smile that had first caught his attention in a smoky saloon. But then again, maybe we needed the journey. Maybe we needed to be broken before we could be whole. "Speaking of journeys," Elijah said, producing an envelope from his pocket. "Wedding present from the town council." Ruby opened it, her eyes widening. "A deed?" "To the old Sinclair cabin. The town bought it, fixed it up, figured we might want a place of our own, somewhere to build that future we keep talking about." Ruby kissed him then, there in the cemetery where so much had ended and begun. When they finally pulled apart, she was crying and laughing simultaneously. From saloon to schoolhouse, to married woman with property, she marveled. What would Blackjack say? That his daughter finally hit the real jackpot. Elijah suggested. They walked back toward town hand in hand, toward the lights and music and community they'd helped save. The Queen's Deal sign glowed in the distance, a reminder of where they'd started. But it was the church spire, reaching toward the stars, that showed how far they'd come. "You know what this means," Ruby said as they reached the celebration. "What?" "You're stuck with me now, preacher, for better or worse. I've faced down gunmen and railroad barons for you." Elijah replied, "I think I can handle married life." Ruby's laugh rang out across Dustwood streets, mixing with the music and voices of their chosen family. And somewhere in the cemetery, the evening breeze stirred the flowers on Samuel's grave, as if the old man himself was adding his blessing to the night. The story of the fallen preacher and the gambler's daughter would be told in Dustwood for generations, embellished with each telling, but never quite capturing the truth of it. How two broken people had found each other in an unforgiving land and chosen to build rather than run. How love had bloomed among violence and greed. How redemption came not from perfection, but from the courage to keep trying, keep fighting, keep believing in second chances. As the stars emerged over the desert, Ruby and Elijah Morgan danced in the street outside the Queen's Deal, surrounded by the town they'd saved and that had saved them in return. Tomorrow they'd face whatever came next. But tonight, they were home, and in Dustwood. That was miracle enough. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us around the campfire for this tale of love and redemption in the Old West. Where are you listening to this story from? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like the frontier folk did. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories that capture the spirit of those wild days, and share your thoughts about Ruby and Elijah's journey. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright and your hearts open to adventure.